All right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Tyler Harms. I'm the Executive Director of Iowa Young Birders. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual event all about trumpeter swans. We are very lucky to have with us this morning David Wolfson, who's a graduate student at the University of Minnesota studying trumpeter swan ecology and in particular trumpeter swan movements. And David's going to be sharing with us today a little bit about trumpeter swans in the Midwest and some about his research. So David, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. It's great to be here. All right, I'll share my screen real quick. Okay, can you see that?
Looks great.
Okay, so thanks everyone for checking out this talk. My name is David Wolfson, and I'm with the Minnesota Cooperative Research Unit, which is part of the University of Minnesota, but affiliated with also working with a lot of state and federal agencies. And as you'll see on this project, it is a big collaborative effort. So my name is up here, but there's many other people associated with this project as well to thank. And I'm especially want to acknowledge the PIs on this project, kind of the head leaders, David Anderson with the Minnesota Cooperative Research Unit and John Feberg with the University of Minnesota. Okay, so on this kind of title slide, this is a painting that John James Audubon did in 1838 when trumpeter swans were widespread and abundant in North America. And yeah, we'll start from there. So the kind of the outline of this talk is I'm going to give a bit of an intro on swan biology, and then sort of move to a history of this particular population of trumpeter swans that I'm studying in the Midwest called the interior population. I'll sort of set the background for my project with what questions motivated it, explain some of our fieldwork, and then end with a bit of the preliminary results that we've seen so far. So there's a few different species of swans that you might see in North America. The trumpeter swan is what we'll be focusing on today. It looks very similar to a tundra swan. It's bigger and there's some minor differences on the bill. And then the snow geese are quite a bit different, but they are also a large white bird. Mute swans seen here, these are not native to North America. They're seen as invasive species and can be competitive and detrimental to native trumpeter swan populations. And as you can see, tundra swans, these will breed way up north in the Arctic region, and then they will migrate through the Midwest before wintering on the East Coast and the West Coast. But the only time that you would be possibly seeing a tundra swan and a trumpeter swan at the same time in Minnesota would be during those migration periods. So trumpeter swans, you can see the range here on the right figure. They breed in the Midwest. There's 3 populations that are kind of categorized by the flyway. So we'll be talking about the Mississippi flyway, and this is the interior population. And there's also a population for the Rocky Mountains, and then one on the West Coast, the Pacific population. So a little bit of biology about trumpeter swans. They're the largest waterfowl species we have, weighing 20 to 30 pounds. Really big birds with 8-foot wingspans, and they have these long necks which actually let them forage on aquatic plants that dabbling ducks can't reach. So this is kind of a cool bit of their evolution. They they're seen as mate for life, and they'll certainly stick with a partner for many years. They'll defend the same territory year after year, so they put a lot of investment into getting good spots, and they can live 20 years or more in the wild, which is quite a lot for a bird. So thinking about where you might find swans, this is kind of a great habitat right here. This is Swan Lake in southern Minnesota. And sort of a couple things that make up really good swan habitat are the depth of the water. So they're like really shallow water wetlands. And the reason for this is because this is where they will find their food that they primarily eat, which is submerged aquatic vegetation. So there's a whole bunch of species that swans will feed on. And then also associated with these plant species are communities of invertebrates, which can be really helpful for cygnets or first-year swans to get some protein as they're kind of developing early in life. So like I said, these long necks let them feed on plants that are a little bit under the surface, so they'll tip up just like a dabbling duck, but they can reach much further. Some other things that are important for swan habitat are shelter. So the swans in the bottom right figure here, these tall kind of vegetation allows them to hide, and especially when they're molting, they really take cover so that they're not apparent to predators because they can't fly away, so they're a bit more vulnerable than normal. And swans will make their nests either on muskrat houses, like the one here, or they sometimes will just build a nest from vegetation, and usually it's something that looks pretty similar, a big pile of cattails. Because they are such big, heavy birds, swans need a lot of room to take off and land. And so they'll kind of get running and use these big feet to run and push off from the water. And they can need as much as 100 feet as a runway to get going. And they also use these big feet as kind of landing pads as they're coming down to slowly get back into the water. Another kind of interesting thing about their feet is that this is what they use to incubate their eggs on a nest. So what a lot of birds do is they'll have a brood patch where they pick the down feathers off of their breast, and then they'll put that the skin of that patch right on the eggs, and this will allow the heat to transfer from their body to keep the eggs warm. So swans have a lot of blood vessels in their big feet, and they can actually do it that way, which is kind of an interesting, unique thing about the species. So now I'm gonna switch to talking about kind of the history of trumpeter swans in North America. So they were thought to be very widespread in the 1800s, but then once market hunting began to really take off, huge numbers of swans began to be harvested. And this was, to not just for subsistence hunting, but to ship off to Europe, both for meat and skins, and also feathers were quite popular in making women's hats for a time. So this picture on the right here, this is called a punt gun. And it's basically an enormous shotgun where you, instead of killing a few birds with one shot, you could kill up to 50. So things got a little out of hand, but after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which prohibited the take of migratory birds unless specifically allowed by regulations or permits, this basically ended unlimited market harvest because people were allowed to set limits of how much of each species you're allowed to have under the law. So after market hunting was ended, their swans had been basically wiped out, and that's how the situation was for a long time. So now I'm starting in basically the middle of the 20th century. There was interest in reintroducing trumpeter swans. So this map shows a lot here. The dashed line is kind of what was seen as the historic breeding range, the area within it. And so the star in the tri-state area of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, this is where Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge is. And this was a refuge that was established in 1935. And one of the primary reasons was actually to try and have a refuge for trumpeter swans to not go extinct. So there was a small relic population there, and their numbers were stable. And then starting in the 1960s, this is when swans from there began to come into the Midwest as people tried to reintroduce them again. First, there was a number that were reintroduced to the area between South Dakota and Nebraska, and then Minnesota followed a little bit after that. However, in the 70s, some biologists in Alaska that were flying found a completely unknown giant population of swans up there, which was quite healthy. had a lot of numbers. And so starting in about the 80s, several states began to take eggs up from Alaska and bring them down to the Midwest to raise and then release on the landscape. So here are some pictures from that. So they would take float planes and actually collect the eggs. Sorry, no, I'm sure I was doing that. Bring them back and raise these swans until they were about 2 years old, and then they'd release them. So Iowa started their reintroductions in the 90s, and there's been a lot of great work putting swans out all over the state. And it's really cool to see all the resightings that people have observed Iowa swans as far away as Colorado, Virginia, Texas, and Canada. And this picture here is Dave Hoffman, who's with the Iowa DNR and who's been kind of one of the leaders of the trumpeter swan reintroduction efforts. So that was a bit of the history, and now I'm going to talk about sort of the motivations for my project and kind of some of the questions that we're trying to think about. So there's some real basics about this interior population that people still don't have a super great handle on, including how prevalent is migration in the winter for these trumpeter swans? How far do they go, and where specifically are they overwintering? As well as when migration might take place and what would initiate swans to maybe fly south for the winter and then come back north in the spring. Also, we'd like to try and find out a bit more about how swans use their landscapes during different times of the year. So maybe there's different kind of biological requirements if they're preparing to molt or nesting, or say trying to fatten up before migration. And so we're going to take a much more intensive look at that. And also, because there were these kind of separate reintroduction efforts, swans were sourced from different areas and populations. There's really not a ton known about kind of how that played out with all the genetics of this interior population. And so that's kind of something we're going to look at too. What's the genetic structure of swans now, and how have we seen maybe those genetics change from the reintroduced swans until what we have today. Also, lead is a really kind of a big problem in terms of swan mortality, getting lead poison from fishing tackle and sinkers. And so we wanted to know, Connell, what is the level of lead exposure that we're seeing among these trumpeter swans throughout their range? And then also, can we tell, are there kind of detrimental effects on swans from lead, and what levels do we see negative effects, and then how might that be affecting swan movements? So to kind of go a little bit more into what helpful benefits these questions could bring, kind of the big movement piece from the beginning, where do they go and when? Knowing how many of the swans migrate versus sort of stay resident on their breeding territories during the winter will be really helpful information, because it'll give a sense of, in the winter, where are all these swans on the landscape, which is important to know for making management plans, surveys. And you can also hopefully identify some important migratory corridors swans are using, and maybe overwintering sites that are really important. So like I said, knowing when they migrate as well could make it so that you can have surveys that are kind of optimized for when the most swans are there. And then understanding, okay, so maybe these habitat types are really important for swans that might be staging at a stopover area during migration. So that's important knowledge too. And then as well, we can also potentially better anticipate how climate change might be affecting trumpeter swans as things heat up, ranges change in terms of plants and communities. And so that could be good to know for sort of planning into the future. Looking at the genetics, it's interesting to sort of evaluate and compare, well, what's sort of the overall genetic viability of this population, but then how does that relate to maybe some of these smaller population segments? So a lot of the states kind of had separate reintroduction plans, and then we're getting like a lot of the swans were from zoos or private propagators, and so there's a whole big kind of blended mix of swans coming in. And so knowing sort of what those different signatures are like, and then also being able to tell if the flow of genes matches the ways that swans are physically mixing on the landscape can be really useful information. Thinking about lead, so there hasn't been a ton of work done on trumpeter swans in the wild. Most of what we know about lead and trumpeter swans is from birds that are brought into rehab centers and are already pretty sick with lead poisoning. And so we were really curious, well, what's sort of the, quote unquote, normal or background amount of lead that swans are getting in the wild? And then also, could we maybe use this information to see, are there potentially kind of like hotspots of lead, or could swans serve as sentinels on the environment to tell us more about what we're seeing in the landscape? It's really hard to field sample for lead on the bottom of a lake in a kind of standardized way. Also because sediment can cover up lead and it's kind of stable in the substrate, but then when water levels drop, that sediment can get disturbed and the lead can get dug up and become bioavailable to animals again. And then also, like I said, we really need a better understanding of these kind of species-specific relationships between how much lead an animal is ingesting and then how that affects their behavior, maybe their survival or nesting or any other kind of aspects like that. So the main way that we're collecting information for this project is by collaring trumpeter swans, and we use it's called a GPS GSM transmitter. So the GPS, most people are familiar with, it's like your phone's GPS, so it'll get a location from satellites in orbit, and then the GSM part means that these transmitters, once they collect that location data every 15 minutes, once a day, they'll try to push or upload that information through a cell phone tower, just like you'd use for your cell phone. And from there, that can go to our database. So you might say, well, how do you get these collars on the swan? So trumpeter swans undergo a complete molt of their flight feathers once a year. So you can see here, this is a swan that had molted his flight feathers, and now these are new feathers growing in here. And so for that period of time, about a month, give or take, swans are not able to fly. And so it's feasible to catch them. You can see here the difference between a swan with nice looking primaries or flight feathers versus one that is just barely starting to grow them in. So it's a pretty big change for the swans, and it's an important part of their annual cycle because they feathers will degrade, and so birds need to continuously replace the feathers to keep them in good shape, to let them fly well. And so some bird species will sort of molt these feathers out one by one, a little bit at a time, and others will do a whole bunch at a time. So that's sort of the strategy for trumpeter swans. During the summer, drop all their flight feathers and then replace them with fresh new ones before the fall. So we used a few different ways to catch swans. Probably one of the best is a airboat in the top right. However, it's not easy to have your own airboat and take it around with you everywhere. So another thing we've used are flat bottom John boats, either with surface drive motors in the center right here, or with long tail mud motors on the left. And this lets you get around on these really shallow wetlands that might only have a couple feet of water. And we've also used canoes and conventional motors as well. So like I was saying, on top of GPS calling, we're also taking blood samples, and these are for the genetic work and also to get a reading of the lead concentrations for every bird that we catch. And then because swans are all neck basically, you know, these collars sit at the base of the neck. The swans don't really pay them any attention, and they're basically negligible. There's no sort of ill effects of having the collar. Each collar is only about 60 grams, and they're 3D printed, so they're super light, and they have solar panels so that they can continuously charge up to be able to power their operation. So this is sort of a map showing where we've had capture so far. So the project originated in Minnesota and then was pretty quickly expanded to include Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Manitoba. And we're all following sort of similar field methods and protocols. And then Arkansas in the blue here, there's going to be a bit of capture and tagging this winter. And this will be to get swans where we know they're making long distance migrations and say, okay, where are these swans breeding? And so all the dots on the right are where we've caught swans, and we've collared about 100 swans so far. In the project's been going for about 2 years. And so this is, we're almost done catching swans. And this is kind of we tried to space out the captures to get sort of a better geographic spread and representation of the entire population. And the only place that we kind of are missing a bunch of swans from the flyway are a little bit in Ontario. And so other than that, there's a pretty good spread across the interior population. Here's what we've seen a little bit with lead. And so each dot is a swan's lead level. And then on the left, this is showing the amount of lead that we're seeing. So this blue line is what's seen as kind of a baseline concentration that is not thought to have ill effects on the swans. And the red line is what people have used, at least in other waterfowl species, as an indication of, okay, this is a harmful level. That may not be a super accurate picture because, for example, the swan all the way on the top right that had a whole bunch of lead seemed to be fine. It's still doing well, making normal movements. And so the other thing to keep in mind about the lead is we're taking measurements from the blood, and this is sort of a real transient way of measuring. So the half-life is only about a couple weeks, and swans can pass lead through and excrete it through their system. So there hasn't been enough research done on lead in waterfowl, and we're still trying to get a better sense of this. Looking at Iowa, there's been 10 trumpeter swans collared in Iowa, mostly in kind of the northern half and a little bit in the eastern part of the state. And then these are the movements we've seen throughout the year. So most of these birds pushed south into Missouri or even into Kansas. And we also saw kind of severe weather events even kind of prompt further southern migration from swans. So there was a polar vortex, I think last year, and right when it hit, a whole bunch of swans, pushed further south into Kansas and Missouri. And after it was done, a few of the swans came back, but some of them also kind of stuck down south for the remainder of the winter. So if you look overall at all the swans we have collared and kind of consider, how many are migrating or not and how far are they going. This is a busy figure, so I'll explain it kind of piece by piece. So this is looking at 1 year of movement during the winter, kind of fall through late winter in 2020. Each of the different colors are a different state in our study. And on the bottom, you have the latitude of where we caught them. So the green dots are Manitoba. So these are swans from northern latitudes all the way at the top of our study map. And going down, swans from Ohio are at the southernmost latitudes, and so those are on the right hand of the graph. The x-axis, or the axis on the left, this shows the distance from where they were caught to how far they traveled throughout the winter. And so if you're all the way at the top, you're not moving far from where you were in the summer. And if you're all the way at the bottom, you're making the biggest movements. And so you can think of all the birds that were at the top of the graph. These are basically birds that are staying in the same places all year round. And then the further you are towards the bottom, you're making longer and longer migratory distances. So if you kind of consider maybe 3 categories of swans, there may be some that are obligate migrate. So obligate means you have to migrate. And so these will maybe migrate. They all go, and they'll go each year. So the Manitoba birds, none stayed up there all winter. They all flew further south. There may be a pretty big range of latitudes where migration is facultative. So that means you can go or you cannot go. It's sort of maybe up to the conditions locally. And so many swans from Minnesota, Michigan, and even into Wisconsin either stayed put completely, or some made pretty long movements. And then this third category of birds that we saw in Ohio, a little bit in Michigan, may never travel long distances. So you might be saying, okay, so why? So one thing that we think is that the presence of open water, or not ice, is really important for swans during the winter, because they forage by tipping up and looking for plants. And so if they're completely iced out, that's not good for swans. So this map here shows sort of where all swans were at a snapshot during the winter. And you can see kind of below this line that I drew on, all the yellow dots are places where it just wasn't cold enough to have ice during the winter. The winters don't get that cold. So these are swans that were on, we're calling it actual or true open water. The green dots, so almost all the Michigan birds and a lot of the ones in Minnesota as well, were on rivers, like kind of major rivers during the winter that don't freeze because the water is moving. And then there were quite a number of swans that were on artificial open water. These are the purple dots. And so this could be downstream from a lock and dam where the water's flowing, and they might release warmer water. It could be near a power plant where warm effluent is released, or at a gravel quarry where they're cleaning gravel, and so it's keeping ice from forming. And so swans are smart animals. Maybe a lot of them have figured out, if I need open water, I don't have to fly all the way down to Missouri to get it. I can just stick in my neighborhood, not have to expend all that energy making these really long distance migratory movements, and be good. And the other kind of wrinkle in this as well is that there are a lot of sites where people are feeding swans during the winter. And so that may have quite an impact on their propensity to migrate or not if they're getting fed. So kind of some of the preliminary findings that we saw were seems to be a partial migration situation where a lot of these swans are staying put in the winter, but then a large number of them also are migrating. And there's a lot of variability from individual to individual, and also between these different states and regions. And that latitude seemed to be kind of an important thing that corresponds with the migration strategies we're seeing. And that rivers and artificial open water likely are allowing swans to winter at higher latitudes than they would otherwise, probably because there's not ice. So I maintain a project website that you can go to for more information. We'll post updates. You can read more about the background of the project. You can see what agencies are involved. And then there's an interactive map where you can see where the swans have moved throughout the entirety of the study, as well as just the last week, kind of what are the most recent movements of swans. You can see our annual reports from each year, and then if you have any questions, you can get in touch with me. So please check that out if you're interested. And then I definitely want to thank all of our kind of partner agencies, Iowa DNR, Michigan DNR, Ohio DNR, Wisconsin DNR, as well as the Trumpeter Swans Society, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Three Rivers Park District, as well as the Canadian Wildlife Service and the Minnesota Co-op Unit. And here is what it looks like when we release the swan. They just kind of swim on their way. And with that, feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments. And thanks very much for checking out this talk.
Awesome. That was fantastic, David. Thanks very much for all that information.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I have one question for you, if you don't mind. Actually,
Sure.
maybe a couple questions. The first is what, in your opinion, was the most surprising result from your research thus far?
I think I didn't realize how many swans would be on like these gravel pits and quarries, which I mean makes sense. You know, if anyone's a birder, they know some of the best spots to go to are wastewater treatment plants. You know, because the birds get what they need. So yeah, but with reintroducing birds from all these different sources and over different time periods, you know, that migratory tendency has to kind of be cultivated and then passed down from generation to generation. And so it may be that as this population is still relatively young and getting off the ground, it'll take some time to develop kind of more quote unquote traditional migratory patterns. And so I'd be really curious if I could look into a crystal ball 20 years in the future and see like, are those gravel quarries still being used as much, or are more swans flying down to Missouri and Arkansas?
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, last question. I think it's probably a simple one. What's it like to hold a trumpeter swan?
That's probably the most common question I get. People think like, oh, I've heard swans are really mean and aggressive, but so you know, we'll approach this one on the water, and then as soon as I pick it up out of the water, there's been a couple times where they've tried to flap their wings a little bit, but I'll just kind of hug their wings to their chest, and they're super docile. They're kind of like, yep, you got me, like just gonna wait while you do your thing. And then luckily, like we don't have to, you know, use sedatives or anything. It's just a pretty quick 5-minute process of, we'll put a metal USGS band on them, we'll put their GPS collar on, get a blood sample, and then just get their weight, measure their bill, and that's about it. Let them go. So it's actually very chill and laid back. Yeah, so it's good.
Cool. And that's important for this type of research, right? You want to try to minimize the stress on the bird as much as possible. And so it's
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you again, David. This has been really fantastic. I appreciate you sharing with the young birders this morning.